Greetings, and welcome to the Carroll C. Arnold Distinguished Lecture. My name is Kent Ono, and I'm First Vice President of the National Communication Association. This lecture recognizes the late Carroll C. Arnold, who was a professor at the Pennsylvania State University, a well-known author of many important works, editor of communication monographs, and a master teacher in the field of communication. We honor his memory by hosting this annual NCA convention event, an event that is sponsored by Pearson, a longtime supporter and friend of NCA. Before introducing this year's Arnold's lecturer, I do want to take a moment to recognize and acknowledge that we are gathered on the unceded land of the Piscataway peoples, the vast coastal area today known as Baltimore City, Maryland, sustained indigenous peoples until the arrival of Europeans beginning in the 1600s. Over the next 400 years, many Piscataway, Lenape, and Susquehannock communities were decimated, absorbed by larger villages and nations, and or forced by the U.S. federal government to move west beyond the Mississippi River with other larger nations. We ask you to join us in acknowledging these communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. NCA also acknowledges that it is often gathered upon unceded lands, and that those gatherings manifested the exclusions and erasures of many indigenous peoples. We acknowledge the grave harm that colonialism brought to these lands, in particular the erasure of both indigenous and African identities, languages, via slavery and racist laws that segregated all peoples into binary classifications of white and black. This acknowledgement demonstrates our commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of colonialism. It is my pleasure, thank you. It is my pleasure to introduce this year's Arnold lecturer, Dr. Lisa A. Flores. Dr. Flores is a scholar of rhetorical studies and critical race, gender, and queer studies in the Department of Communication at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her work on historical rhetoric of Mexican immigration, whiteness, intersectionality, critical race theory, and communication have been foundational to the field of communication and have influenced generations of scholars. Besides this honor, Dr. Flores has this year won what some are now referring to as the Triple Crown. The 2019 Douglas W. Enninger Distinguished Rhetorical Scholar Award, the 2019 Distinguished Scholar Award of the Rhetorical and Communication Theory Division of NCA, 2019 Distinguished Scholar Award of the Critical Cultural Studies Division of NCA, and of course is our lecturer here. So. Such accolades make sense, for her view of rhetoric is compelling. She sees public discourse as a central site through which citizens come to occupy the worlds they envision. As past president of the Western States Communication Association, book review editor for Quarterly Journal of Speech, and forum editor for Women's Studies in Communication, and as a member of 14 communication journal editorial boards, Dr. Flores has significantly influenced the field of communication and its scholarship, and perhaps more importantly, encouraged us all to examine ourselves and our roles in the world, and to do so with a generous and ethical spirit, one that places humanity and a civic contribution first. Dr. Flores is one of the most influential communication scholars today. Her work regularly appears on the syllabi of undergraduate courses and graduate seminar courses in rhetorical criticism and theory, race and communication, critical intercultural communication, sports communication, and gender and communication. She burst onto the communication scene back in 1996 with the publication of her article, Creating Discursive Space Through Rhetoric of Difference, Chicana Feminists Craft a Homeland, which was published in the Quarterly Journal of Speech. Since then, the field has benefited from her regular contributions to scholarship, such as her article, Reclaiming the Other, Toward a Chicana Feminist Critical Perspective, which appeared in the International Journal of Intercultural Relations in 2000. as well as Constructing Rhetorical Borders, Peons, Illegal Aliens, and Competing Narratives of Immigration, which appeared in Critical Studies and Media Communication in 2003. More recently, in 2016, in an article titled Between Abundance and Marginalization, The Imperative of Racial Rhetorical Criticism, which appeared in the Review of Communication, she challenged rhetorical scholars to see their work as racial rhetorical criticism and to take up that mantle with pride and determination. As someone who has been on many cutting edges throughout her career, making contributions across subdisciplinary parts of the field such as whiteness studies, critical intercultural communication, performance studies, and masculinity studies, and as one of the field's finest wordsmiths, Dr. Flores is the perfect person to give this year's annual Arnold Lecture. As her work always does, Dr. Flores' lecture, Mobility, Containment, and the Racialized Spatio-Temporalities of Survival is sure to challenge us personally, make us think and feel, and teach us new ways race and racism continue to survive. Without further ado, please help me welcome Dr. Lisa A. Flores.
Clicker here somewhere. And there are still 2 seats up front. Thank you, Kent. I don't know where you went, but thank you for that incredibly generous introduction and for the invitation to speak here tonight. I want to add my thanks to the NCA team. You all do so many hours of work to make these few days possible for us, and I hope that you know that we appreciate that. And I want to thank all of you for being here tonight. It's late in the conference already, and we're tired, and here you are, and so I'm very grateful to have you here to share ideas with me. And it's just an incredible honor for me to be able to think together with you tonight. I want to add additional thanks to my family, to my parents, Enrique and Yolanda. Is there a problem? The sound is okay? But it says don't touch them. To my parents, Enrique and Yolanda, is that better? They still don't really understand what I do, but they are always incredibly supportive of me. To my partner, Marianne Villarreal, and my daughters, Amaris and Aliana. In particular, my daughters were very graciously allowed me to be here while I missed a dance performance, a play, and a piano recital. So, I also want to thank my colleagues at the University of Colorado Boulder. We have an amazing community of faculty and graduate students and some incredible intellectual energy. And I think it's in that spirit of that intellectual energy that what I bring to you was possible because of the conversations we have and because of the generosity of that entire community. So all of you here just know that I appreciate that. And finally, to the Communication Scholars for Transformation, I want to thank you. I had a conversation today with a young scholar who is making a change in her graduate career, and we talked a little bit about hope. And Communication Scholars for Transformation, you bring hope, so thank you. On June 11th of 2013, the 11-year-old Sebastian de la Cruz sang the national anthem at Game 3 of the NBA Finals. Performing in full mariachi gear, El Charo de Oro, or the boy with the golden voice, opened the game that would be won by the San Antonio Spurs. By many accounts, his performance was amazing, fantastic, spectacular.
Or the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streamed, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say
Despite his talent, De la Cruz faced immediate backlash with a torrent of racist comments on social media decrying the abomination. This one in particular drew my scholarly attention. The young De la Cruz is reduced to the easy slur, wetback. Less than a year later, just outside of an Arizona immigration detention center, immigration advocates gathered to support a 14-day hunger strike that demanded, quote, not one more deportation. As they sat, prayed, and meditated, a car pulled up. A man lowered the window, shouted racial epithets, and then threw a wrapped burrito at the advocates. It says, learn English, wetback. Go back to Mexico. In that same month, Texas Senate hopeful Chris Mapp told the editorial board of the Dallas Morning News that Texas ranchers should be allowed to shoot on sight any wetbacks on their land. Despite the criticism he received, Mapp initially refused to apologize, claiming that use of the term is, quote, as normal as breathing air in South Texas. A year prior, Alaskan Congressman Don Young invoked the term during a radio interview.
My father had a ranch. We used to hire 50 to 60 wetbacks and to pick tomatoes. You know, it takes two people to pick the same tomatoes now. It's all done by machine.
Young did apologize after his reference to the wetbacks that worked on his father's ranch. In that apology, he explained that it was, quote, a term that was commonly used during my days growing up on the farm. I know this term is not used in the same way nowadays, and I meant no disrespect. I meant to preface by telling you that every time I say the term wetback, I hope that you know it's in scare quotes. And when I say other terms or make other references to what sound like incredibly racist things, I hope that you know that unless they are in quotes, they are not mine. Normal, common, even unintentional, a descriptive category, and a decisive threat. The term wetback has been and continues to be a racial and racist term that narrates race through nation. It's a curious and elastic term that originated as a means to capture the common practice across parts of the Texas-Mexico border that entailed crossing the Rio Grande in order to enter the U.S. That crossing at points requires swimming and thus getting wet. It's difficult to identify the moment in which the term was born, but it most likely dates back to the mid-1920s, probably 1926, just after the passage of the Immigration Act of 1924 and the 1925 institution of the Border Patrol. Along with its term illegal alien, the term entered into U.S. public and political discourse just as the national fears associated with the so-called hordes of undesirable European and Asian immigrants were quelled through restrictive national legislation that shifted border anxiety from the sea borders to the land borders, most notably to the U.S.-Mexico border. Though rare in public and political discourse at the time, it did make the occasional appearance. For instance, in 1926, the Saturday Evening Post included an article titled Wet and Other Mexicans, which reported that a Mexican who enters the U.S. illegally has come to be known as a wet Mexican. In 1929, economist Glenn Hoover, writing in Foreign Affairs, commented rather matter-of-factly on undocumented Mexican entry. Quote, the peon walks or swims the border and is welcomed by his countrymen as a wetback. Despite these occasional references, the term did not circulate widely until the late 1940s and early 1950s, when the nation rather suddenly paid heightened attention to the so-named wetback problem. It was at that time, according to Juan Garcia, that, quote, seemingly overnight, the public was flooded with a mass of articles and feature stories concerning undocumented workers. In confirmation of that argument, Addison Hench noted that by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the term was listed in various dictionaries. By 1956, Pacific Coast Pictures released the film Wetbacks. Starring Lloyd Bridges, Nancy Gates, and Barton McLean, the film traced the plight of two U.S. citizens, Jim and Sally, both stranded in a Mexican village. They became embroiled in an exploitative operation smuggling Mexicans into the U.S. The smuggled wetbacks in the field emerge as the victims of ruthless Mexican smugglers. Today, the term remains somewhat common, still easily invoked as a quick slur. On Urban Dictionary, for instance, you can buy a mug featuring both the term and its dictionary definition, which I've made larger for you there. The definition, like several others circulating, elides the literal original significance of the term, the reference to entering the U.S. along the Texas-Mexico border and by crossing the Rio Grande. Much of the rest of the U.S.-Mexico border is not water, it's desert, perhaps urban area. This, in red, is the U.S.-Mexico border. In blue, we have the Rio Grande. There's a considerable difference between them. So there's something curiously elastic in definitions that expand the term so that it becomes, as in the Oxford English Dictionary, this definition. Suddenly it's any Mexican, regardless of residency. That means there's many of us in here who have suddenly been reduced to wetbacks. Now, the OED does signal the early but now mostly forgotten reference to the crossing of the Rio Grande. And these two dictionary definitions are not uncommon. All of the online dictionaries that I checked participated in some expanded definition of the term, sometimes referencing the origin, but then moving quickly to equating it today with undocumented Mexican or perhaps Central American entry. I pause on this term tonight. I pause on wetback for what it tells us about the intersections of rhetoric and race. My investment lies largely in the project that I have named as racial rhetorical criticism. A central task of racial rhetorical criticism, at least for me, is the development of theories that account for the rhetoricity of race. That is, if we argue, as many of us tend to, both in communication and across other disciplines, that race is a social construct or a discursive materialization, then we in communication should lead the theoretical conversations around race. In my efforts to participate, today I center the term wetback and advance an argument for what I call racial recognition. I'll spend most of my time with you tonight in the national conversations at play during the wetback era, those years from 1944 through 1954. If these were the formative years during which the term became a part of the national conversation, then it seems to me that this is where we start. During this time, the discourse around the wetback problem was at its core a national debate about the place of Mexican workers within the U.S. Historically within the U.S., the term immigrant has referred, at least publicly, to a presumed permanent move. Thus, the idea of immigrant has been laden with an intentional, permanent relocation, a movement not just across space, from there to here, but into a new chosen identity, a temporal move from past to future. These definitional parameters conflict with those that are established by the term wetback. The term wetback precludes such movement. Instead, wetback puts in place a different movement, a chaotic and immense movement that can only exist outside of national belonging, in part because the frenetic movement of wetbacks was a racialized movement embedded in the already racially laden logic of the border. To understand this more fully, I'd like to spend a bit of time on some historical context. And I'd like to take you to two critical wetback moments, both occurring in the midst of a national debate around the problems of undocumented Mexican migration. The first incident is remembered today as the El Paso incident, and it occurred in October of 1948. Even as constituents across the country were decrying the presence of undocumented Mexicans within the U.S. border agents did something unusual, something directly at odds with the worries about increased numbers of Mexicans. On October 13, 1948, U.S. border agents in El Paso, Texas, intentionally and unilaterally opened the gates. The Los Angeles Spanish-language newspaper La Opinión reported that for 5 days men gathered at the border, and then, upon entry, they waded across the shallow river in direct sight of the Border Patrol, which received them with formality, herded them into temporary enclosures, and immediately paroled them to cotton growers, who trucked them at once to the fields. In this affront to the Mexican government, the U.S. Border Patrol flaunted their disregard for established agreements that both nations would do everything possible to reduce undocumented Mexican entry. Some 7,000 to 8,000 men entered the country. A few years later, a similar event occurred. This time, on January 15, 1954, in what's now known as the Incident of 1954, the U.S. Departments of Labor, State, and Justice collaborated on and issued a press release stating that U.S. employment contracts would be given to Mexicans crossing the border. Despite extreme measures taken by the Mexican government to prevent an exodus, some 12,000 men gathered at the border, particularly in Mexicali, near San Diego. And on January 22nd, U.S. officials opened the gates. Reports of the event describe it as chaotic, if not sadly absurd. Mexican officers allegedly grabbed hold of men, pulling on them and beating them to try to stop them from crossing. In contrast, U.S. border agents helped Mexican men legalize their crossing, telling them that once they were in the U.S., they needed to step a toe back over the border, thus fulfilling requirements that they return and re-enter legally. One widely circulated image depicts a man being pulled by one arm back into Mexico and the other into the U.S. Within a few days, as the Mexican officials realized they could not prevent the mass departure, they moved to a new strategy. It amuses me. They announced that they would no longer try to deter individuals from leaving. In response, the U.S. announced a new interim program to regulate entry. And by January 27th, immigration officials in the U.S. and U.S. police formed a human chain to try to stop Mexicans from entering the country. Now, both of these open border moments occurred in the midst of this so-called wetback era. Though several thousand undocumented Mexican migrants were invited into the U.S. in October 1948 and January 1954, those open invitations stood in direct opposition to claims that the U.S. faced a crisis, or at least a problem. Spurred by fears that Mexican workers were no longer confined to the agricultural fields of the Southwest, but were now spilling over into industrial centers across the country, headlines proclaimed swarms of wetbacks into the U.S. and predicted dire results for the nation should the flood continue. The problem was so great that by mid-1954, just a few months after the 1954 incident, the U.S. embarked on a highly publicized deportation campaign named Operation Wetback. Wetback, as a term, I suggest, makes race. It makes race through an anxious collapse of temporality and spatiality, mobility and containment, affecting what I name racial recognition. As I'll elaborate, racial recognition is a discursive mode of rhetorical racialization. I'll argue that we, everyday citizens, are asked, even expected to know race when we see it, and in that knowing, to contain its ever frightful excessive mobility. The recognition is the rhetorical means through which race itself survives. Now, we're at least decades, if not a century, deep into conversations, both popular and scholarly, that name race as a cultural, social, or discursive construct. We might trace these arguments to 1897 and W.E.B. Du Bois' essay, The Conservation of Races. There he wrote, "What then is a race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life." With his emphasis on common language, traditions, and histories, and his framing of a vast family, Du Bois challenged prevalent theories that named race through phenotype and biology. Scientific theories continued to hold for some time, but in the wake of World War II and racial genocide, they came into question again. There we might consider the work of Gunnar Myrdal, Robert E. Park, or even the Chicago School more broadly. Advancing both subtle and direct questions on the primacy of biological and social theories of race as natural and inherent, these theorists put in place the early building blocks upon which much contemporary race theory now rests. Today, I think many of us in this room would argue that social construction theories of race reign. Now, I detour all too briefly, all too quickly through this early history, as it is in many ways this history that animates my interest in racial recognition. I'm puzzled by social, political, public, and scholarly fixation with race. If we all agree that race is socially constructed, then why do we remain so intent on seeing it, knowing it, naming it? Is it the persistent slipperiness, yet oddly rigid nature of race that compels so much investment in this task? Because for all that social construction theories have mostly displaced biological and scientific ones, we everyday citizens remain attached to some concept of race as real. It is at least in part the alleged realness of race that prompts such often benevolent questions as, where are you from, or what are you? It is the realness of race that fosters suspicion and antagonism towards so-called scholarship kids or diversity hires. That same realness motivates and perpetuates police brutality against blacks and stand your ground laws, as well as restrictive immigration laws. Or as Nadine Ellers argues, there is a language of crisis prevalent in the varied yet consistent narratives of race. And crisis, she reminds us, is figured through jeopardy, risk, even loss. The crisis of race, Ellers explains, is one of racial truth, or the absence of racial truth. It is the crisis of ontology. For despite widely proclaimed theories of race as cultural, social, constructed, or discursive, the truth of whiteness remains premised upon the truth or the realness of blackness, the superiority of whiteness, the superiority that says they must be here on scholarship, or she must be a diversity hire, is only guaranteed when it is set against the assumed inferiority of blackness. It is the need for ontological security, Ellers writes, that installed one-drop and anti-miscegenation laws. If blackness could not cross into whiteness, then whiteness remained intact, pure. But of course, such laws could not and did not contain the slipperiness, the evasiveness of race. Its movement into whiteness, much like migrant movement into the nation, permeates, even pollutes. In doing so, it threatens the ontological security of whiteness, thus prompting even greater crisis. And it is in this argument of racial ontological crisis that I think racial recognition. I'm motivated here by Nadine Ellers, who continues her argument by invoking Judith Butler, performativity, and the persistent reiteration of race. Race is a practice, an ongoing discursive practice of racing individuals that must be maintained in order to survive. The categories accepted as natural and inevitable must consistently be called upon, called forth, if you will, for without possessing ontological grounding, the truths of racial categorization and demarcation exist only in the retelling. The claim is profound, and it is not one that I have heard made by rhetorical or communication scholars of race. The truths of racial categorization and demarcation demanded by the ontological insecurity of race exist only in the retelling. The implication of this for me is this: if race, even as social construction or discursive materialization, is in persistent ontological crisis, if we need to know that it exists, and yet we are confronted with endless instances that call such existence into question, then we need a resolution to the crisis. We need ontological security. The retelling of race in language produces the seeing of race as real. Now, proof of race is supposed to lie in its phenotypic evidence, or in what Matthew Guthrell names racial sightlines. That is, we learn to rely on the physical body, on phenotype, as evidence of the existence of race and racial difference. Sri Carlson captures this argument in her astute phrase, "You know it when you see it." She's arguing that the truth of race lies in its phenotypic evidence. This optic assumption is, of course, widespread, commonplace. Yet despite the seemingly inescapable force of the body as the carrier of race, its capacity to speak racial truth is limited. Its reliability as evidence that racial categories exist, that can be seen or known or marked or regulated, is as tenuous as it is certain. For as much as phenotypic signs and signals prove race, so too does race remain slippery, its ontological security threatened by the unruliness of the body. White and non-white mix quite literally, and each such mixture fuels the crisis. Each such mixture activates the need to see and to know or to recognize. Recognition, as you may know, is widely theorized. From philosophy to psychology, from law to political science, scholars are invested in questions of recognition. For this project, I turned to feminist and queer theorists who advance theories of recognition premised on intersubjectivity, mutuality, and likeness. In brief, this work suggests that we recognize each other when we see aspects of ourselves reflected in each other. In that reflection, we feel a sense of connection and mutuality, a sense that we have the same shared experiences, feelings, ways of being. Mutuality, then, is a way of thinking likeness. If we believe that we have shared histories or shared experiences, shared beliefs or cultural practices, then we are like each other. We recognize each other in and through that likeness. It's that feeling of instant connection with individuals we do not know. For many feminist and queer theorists, this recognition hinges on such identity categories as gender, race, and sexuality. We are like each other in our shared gender or our shared queer politic. For the most part, however, this work theorizes recognition at the individual level. And while recognition certainly happens interpersonally, it also happens rhetorically among publics, in and through our discourse. My theory of racial recognition suggests that shared vocabularies, common languages, retold stories also prompt recognition. The constant circulation of the term wetback produces the seeing and knowing of wetbacks. Here's where we need race scholars to help us think with theories of recognition. Folks like Matthew Fry Jacobson and Nadine Ellers think race and recognition, even if they do so indirectly. For instance, both talk about recognizing race, or what they would probably name seeing it, as a social compulsion, again born in the ontological insecurity of race. Despite their dramatically different projects, both Jacobson and Ellers argue that the elusiveness or arbitrariness of race, the willful resistance of bodies to abide by rigid social categories, is deeply unsettling, particularly within whiteness. Jacobson, for instance, notes the seemingly natural but finally unstable logic of race, while Ellers argues that America desperately requires the body to speak the truth of race and is destabilized by the possibility that the body will fail to articulate this truth. The instability perpetuates the insistent discursive reiteration of race, which is also the rhetorical bounding and fixing of race. The constant but impossible attempt to fix, I suggest, prompts racial recognition, for the desire to know racial truths manifests in the need to be able to see such truths. Jacobson details the seeing of and knowing of racial truths through his argument that race is both a perceptual and a conceptual category, a seeing from and a seeing as. The seeing of phenotypic racial differences, he argues, is not just a seeing of a marked body, but of presumed real differences in character, heritage, even essence, signaled by that marked body. His argument is worth quoting at length. The visible markers may then be interpreted as outer signs of an essential, inner, immutable, moral, intellectual character, and that character, in its turn, attested to by physical difference, is summoned up to explain the social value attached in the first place. The circuit is ineluctable. Race is social value become perception. In ways that align with Jacobson, Ellers also hints toward a notion of racial recognition. It is discursive power that makes race perceptible because it teaches or instructs people to read by it. The reading, she notes, happens along what she names the fictive loci of race, color and blood, or what I think of as skin and character. For Ellers, color and blood function as racial codes that circulate metaphorically across discourse to, quote, consume virtually all meaning pertaining to race and simultaneously to fashion all racial meaning. Blood and color, again skin and character, collapse into each other, and in that collapse, they produce racial knowledge and racial truth. Building across this scholarship, I define racial recognition as the compulsive seeing and finding of likeness in discourse that resists reducing likeness to mutuality. That is, rather than presume likeness entails an intersubjective claim of mutual connection between two individuals, Racial recognition thinks likeness as likeness to a circulating discourse, such as a racial category. The likeness is not likeness in terms of mutuality or sameness between individuals in an interaction, but sameness between individuals presumed to share certain characteristics, what Jacobson might name as the collapse between the perceptual and the conceptual. A theory of recognizing race in and on individuals, as well as seeing individuals as instantiations of presumed racial essences, racial recognition accounts for the two key modes through which race has historically been understood: phenotype and character, color and blood. It turns on the collapse between the seeing and the knowing. It is in the collapse between the perceptual and conceptual, between skin and blood, that we see race. Racial recognition thus suggests that the very premise that one can see race grounds the argument that race exists to be seen. It is a move that fixes and locates bodies on a racial scale. This one is Mexican, that one is white. If collapse is one mode through which race is recognized, excess is another. I think of excess here as the affective register of race. Racial recognition entails not just a seeing of race, but an experiencing of it, a felt response to its existence. Where collapse accounts for the falling together of skin and blood, perceptual and conceptual, excess names the flow of race from the body, its animation beyond itself, a kind of bodily transgression. That excess of race, what Wahili might name as fleshy surplus, is that which refuses to be fixed and contained. Out of control, the excess of race is the threat of race. It is that quality of race that belies the rigidity of racial categories. Race is then both seen and felt. Moving between modes of collapse and excess, racial recognition theorizes the discursive seeing and sensing of race, attending to discursive reiterations of race bodies in motion and race bodies contained. It captures the static mobility of race, its presumed manifestation in fixed and bounded categories, and its persistent escape from those categories. The constant circulation of narratives or vocabularies produce racial sightlines and prompt the perceptual-conceptual collapse. In other words, if wetbacks populate the discourse, that discourse makes race. And in the early 1950s, wetbacks populated the discourse. They were everywhere. They were in headlines. They were in politics. For instance, American consul in Mexico Culver Giddon invoked the term in his report to the Department of State, where he commented on the actual number of wetbacks. Secretary of Labor James Mitchell, in his letter to the American Federation of Labor, wrote of the wetback problem. Notably, Mitchell was quite the advocate for Mexican migrants, both documented and undocumented. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, in 1954, the nation embarked on Operation Wetback. The language was pervasive. Most often when the term was used, it was accompanied with a definition or an explanation. Sometimes the definition was quite simple: illegal entrance. Elsewhere, there was more elaboration. Together, these varied reiterations, definitions, and explanations prompt the perceptual-conceptual collapse. The term itself, wetback, condenses body and movement, the body that crosses illegally. In the literal equation of entry and criminality, color and blood, skin and heritage collapse. The term then is not just a label or a slur or an epithet. It produces a category of being. One becomes a criminal wetback threat. The collapse is a mode of containment, a mode of fixing race. In part, it does so because the term simply references the body. One is a wetback. It also signals criminal illegal movement into the U.S. One is also a wetback. And every single reference to the term, then or now, names wetback as part of a national problem. In one word, race maps with nation, movement, and criminality. But of course, the making of race that happens through wetback is not just about criminality and entry. It is also about reproducing undocumented Mexicans as the nation's labor source, adding another layer to the making of race. For it was, of course, this labor that prompted those two open border events. Wetbacks were not just criminals, a frame that marshals a particular agency. They were also passive, childish, docile, exploitable. In the words of one journalist, quote, "They do not argue, do not agitate, do not complain," end quote. Quote, "Hungry and pathetic," end quote, wetbacks would work for wages that Americans would not consider accepting. These very depictions of wetback labor align with what Ehlers names blood, and again, what I think of as character. But oddly, and in another moment of collapse, this docility is not just about character, it is also about color, or the physical body. This is a docility read on the body. In one report, a journalist noted that when faced with arrests, Mexicans would shrug and smile, offering a resigned mala suerte. Their cheerful compliance with arrest was described endlessly. Quote, "See, Senor Inspector, you remind me last year the desert and the track cannot lie." Docility thus was not just a character trait, it was an embodied way of being that is seen on the body. The docile, wetback body speaks its race, and in doing so it offers proof of its own alienness, its own inferiority. At the same time, the docility of race is a docility that acts. The action, however, is not the intentional action of the gentle subject, but the threatening action of race. It is that excessiveness that leaks and flows, unrestrained and polluting, always frighteningly mobile. If collapse makes race through the ways that the perceptual becomes conceptual, or in the merger of color and blood, skin and character, excess makes race in the ways that it figures race as out of control, everywhere, the body almost escaping itself. It is that uncontrolled bodily danger that threatens always to contaminate. In language deeply embedded with the scripts of blackness, wetback bodies were figured as threat largely through how their bodies and ways of being moved. Consider this extended commentary by a South Texas citizen to a letter in the Texas Goodwill Commission. Mexicanness exceeds the body. It is so great a filth that it reeks and it drops. The docility of the wetback, a docility that embeds wetbacks with a childish, almost infantile acquiescence to authority, is also its threat, for it is an active, natural, perhaps even biologically a gentle docility that exceeds itself, falling always on the hapless white bodies. Again, this kind of commentary was typical. Mexicans were associated with a leaky, excessive dirtiness. But of course, the excess of race was not just about the wetback body, it was also in the movement of the wetback body. The wetback problem was a problem of movement. In emphases of arrest and deportations, as well as in the tides of wetbacks that flooded the nation and the hordes that swarmed in, wetbacks were perpetually a problem either because they moved or because they failed to move. These excesses of mobility make race through both time and space, affecting another collapse. Time and space are imbricated with each other, producing particular racialized spatio-temporalities. Border crossing is, of course, a movement across space from there to here. But the movement is not just spatial, it is also temporal. The spatio-temporal question is whether the there is racialized as like here or not like here. There, Raka Shoma and Radha Hegde remind us, is rarely a neutral space. It is the location of difference. The there of difference is temporal and spatial. Migration from traditional countries or from primitive and backward countries migrants from traditional countries or from primitive and backward countries are temporally and spatially different. In the discourse surrounding the wetback problem, the spatio-temporalities of wetback were manifest in the chaos and intensities of their movement. In language reminiscent of contemporary public conversations, Mexican movement into the U.S. was figured through nature metaphors, typically water ones. There were the familiar tides and floods that pour into the U.S. There were also animal metaphors. Like associations with dirtiness, these metaphors describe the immensity and naturalness of the problem. The metaphors cast a particular kind of movement that was animalistic in both body and character. These metaphoric frames were not unique to this time or even to Mexican migration. They were and are the deterministic screens through which undesirable migration is imagined. The familiarity is significant. The ways migrants are imagined as moving into the nation, both literally and figuratively, circulates around their recognizability. Simply put, migrants come to belong where they can be seen and recognized as like other national bodies. To be seen and recognized, a body must be fixed, like us. But there is a paradox. Recognition demands a body static enough to be read and fixed into an identity position, yet migrants by definition are mobile and dislocated, unseeable and unrecognizable. Racial recognition makes them recognizable. The familiarity or recognizability of the two main sets of metaphors around Mexican movement, nature and animal, enables the seeing and knowing of them. Both sets of metaphors have rhetorical force, perhaps even archetypal force, from our daily experiences and our sets of knowledge. We know, or at least we think we know, the immensity of a flood or a tide. It is a body of water whose size cannot easily be measured, whose movement is only partly predictable or containable. Excessive by definition, outside of human control. This first sense of familiarity is potent. A flood is seeable and knowable in its opposition to humanity. It's joined by the second sense of familiarity, reiteration. These frames were already in place. The sense-making of this moment was then quick and easy, almost instantaneous. Imagined thus, Mexicans could be immediately seen, recognized in their difference, if not as their difference. The animalistic movement of wetbacks, the furtive slinking that is necessary to undocumented entry and natural to dogs, birds, and ants, maps onto Mexican bodies. Wetbacks were noticeable in their movement, even as the threat they carried was in their ability to sneak in unnoticed. So for all that wetbacks were narrated through a frenzied, uncontrollable movement, they were also named as easily and quickly managed. As discourse drew attention to the crossings, it also recounted the stoppages. Set against the reports of floods and streams were endless accounts of arrests and of deportations. This careful accounting of Mexican bodies both reinforced the immensity and magnitude of wetback movement, as it also refused the force of nature that constituted the discourse. Thus, readers were assured that even floods and swarms could be controlled, made inferior, contained. Again, it is racial recognition that makes this containment possible. The tension between the spatio-temporalities of movement and containment secure the moral order of superiority that is fundamental to the rhetorical making of race. Animal metaphors and nature metaphors juxtaposed against the hierarchical superiority of whiteness and of humanity, of civilization, make possible the awesome fear of the uncontrollable and the triumph of whiteness against that seeming impossibility. It is here finally in the intersection of wetback as a term of the body, with wetback as a body that moves animalistically, that the discourse of the wetback problem produced race as real. Oh, shoot. Sorry, got too click happy. Okay, you got a little teaser. In February of 2014, when the silent protesters outside of a detention center in Phoenix, Arizona were assaulted for their commitments to justice by the callous actions of a passerby in a stereotypic burrito, they stood a mere 2.5 hours by car from the U.S.-Mexico border. Though certainly some of the detainees may have been from out of state, it is also quite likely that the majority either had been living in Phoenix or the surrounding area, or had crossed into the U.S. not by wading across the Rio Grande, but by trekking through the Sonoran Desert at a crosspoint in eastern Arizona. That corridor is one of the most dangerous points for undocumented entry. The terrain is simply not meant for most human life. Yet it has become one of the two most common entry points for undocumented crossing. The other location in West Texas has a similar terrain. Both sites are littered with the remains, with the refuse of those who did not survive the crossing. In 2018 alone, the Pima County, Arizona medical examiners recovered the remains of 127 bodies in the southern Arizona desert, all presumed to be migrants. In 2017, they recovered 128 bodies. They believe that the bodies they found represent about half of the total numbers of dead bodies. And over the past 20 years, the numbers of deaths in the Arizona desert are staggering. Total crossings are down, but the numbers of deaths are constant or rising, at least in Arizona and the Texas desert regions. So why then do so many migrants cross at these two deadly points of entry? Because U.S. border regulation practices have intentionally funneled undocumented migrants to these sites. The idea is deterrence. And if we consider the decline in attempted entry, then perhaps the idea is a good one. But as I think many of us in this room will agree, there is no stopping undocumented crossing. The conditions of living for many, if not most, migrants, whether in Mexico or Central America, offer little other choice. And we, the U.S., have responsibility for those living conditions. But even without those often deadly living conditions, we, the U.S., continue to play the economic politics that we engaged in El Paso in 1947 and in Mexicali in 1954. While we may not open the gates today, we continue to invite, if not demand, cheap, unexploitable, undocumented entry. In their recent anthology, La Vida No Vale Nada, Life is Worth Nothing, Migrant Deaths in the Arizona Desert, editors Raquel Rubio Goldsmith, Celestino Fernandez, Jesse Finch, and Araceli Masterson Algar, along with the various contributing authors, reflect upon the surging migrant deaths in the Arizona desert. Across the disparate yet united essays, this is one clear point. For Mexicans, for wetbacks, La Vida No Vale Nada. The deaths are a mere blip on an overcrowded national agenda. These deaths are a register of what it might mean to communicate for survival. Much of what I've shared with you from the 1950s and the discourse of the wetback problem is removed from our everyday. Though some of you here were familiar with Operation Wetback, that 1954 mass deportation drive, others of you were not. Or maybe you learned of it recently when Donald Trump invoked it as a model worth emulating. The emphasis in the subhead, which I've retyped for you to be able to read, is revealing. Though the United States has since abandoned the racial epithets its operations names, the legacy continues. There is no doubt that wetback as a term does not have the public circulation it did during the wetback decade or era. But as Sebastian de la Cruz would remind us, it also has not disappeared. More importantly, however, for me, are the rhetorical linkages between wetback, the hate and violence it encapsulates and spreads, and survival. It is the legacy of wetback that concerns me. Racial recognition is not just a means of explaining the rhetorical force of the term wetback. It is a theory of the rhetorical making of race. The migrants who cross or attempt to cross the massive Sonoran Desert are dying of thirst. They are desperate for water. Despite their desert trek, they are still just wetbacks, whose lives no vale nada. Epithets such as wetback make race in the ways they direct our perceptual and conceptual attention. Excessive and mobile, these epithets adapt to the moment, making race anew, even in ways far removed from their original invocations. The legacy of the term, or what I name its survival, is testimony to, if not evidence of, the rhetorical making of race. Again, I theorize racial recognition not to account for what was at play during the wetback era. I do so because I'm convinced that the rhetorical making of race is a persistent, insistent, and inescapable practice that we all participate in. It is at play in every moment of overt racism. Each such moment makes and fixes race, containing its excesses in the perceptual conceptual collapse. But it is also at play in virtually every public, rhetorical, or communicative moment, epithet or no epithet. We, everyday citizens, have been instructed into the epithets so that regardless of our politics, we seek constantly to see and know race. Every such moment of seeing and knowing is a moment of collapse and excess. We contain the mobility, frightened by or repulsed by its spatio-temporal excesses, holding it so that the ontological truth of race remains primary. Just a few weeks ago, historian Nell Irvin Painter wrote a beautiful and profoundly sobering essay, or editorial for the New York Times. Titled A Racist Attack Shows How Racism Evolves, the piece traced a horrific and now all too familiar incident of racism. 2 young boys harassed and assaulted 4 young black girls, using racial epithets that get similar, if not greater, hate than wetback, and urinated on the girls. The 2 boys of South Asian descent used violence to contain race. Painter's point is this: participation in racism is aspirational participation in whiteness. Days after reading Painter's essay, I came across this headline. When I read both pieces, I was struck by the survival of race and racism. The move to invoke the slur, whatever the slur, is a rhetorical move to fix and locate. It is a move of recognition. Each act of recognition is an act of race-making. Whoever invokes does whiteness, remakes whiteness. Whoever is invoked is remade all at once and all too quickly and easily. But here's the thing. If race is a construct, social, discursive, performative, and here I do not mean to erase or minimize the critical theoretical nuances between these terms, but if race is a construct, then it is already beyond such control. As the various theories that advance race through construction and/or discourse remind us, there are endless possibilities that promise ever slightly new, but still new remakings. The very race bodies also belie the daily truth of race. Every mixed-race child is testament to the failures of race. And each new wave of undocumented Mexicans into this country is also testament to survival, both the survival of racism and the survival of Mexicans. About 25 years ago, I went to a reading by Chicana poet Alicia Gaspar de Alba. The inscription she wrote to me in her book has stayed with me. Survival is the ultimate resistance. As we continue our conversations about communication and survival, I ask that we all remember the dual sides of survival. In racial recognition, race survives, often in its most caricaturish and violent ways. But racial recognition is a rhetorical theory of race. As such, it is premised in the second possibility for survival, and that is resistance. For as much as all of us, but really many of you, will continue to participate in discourses of racial recognition, some of us will refuse to be contained. Thank you.